I'm really pleased to welcome back up here with me filmmaker Brett Story, who also is a recent Sundance Fellow as well. So again, thank you so much for showing this here. We're so happy to have premiered it.
No, thank you.
Thanks
for inviting me. It's wonderful.
I wanted to ask you a few questions before we open it up. Can you talk a little bit about the origin of this? Like, where did this come from? Where did you get the idea to even start exploring the prison system?
Yeah.
As a Canadian, I should say, the American prison system as like a Canadian woman.
Yeah,
like,
yeah. So I mean, the film had a few different origins. I've been doing work around prisons in a variety of senses for many years. Prison social justice organizing, some academic work, and had been thinking about, one thinks about a lot of things that they want to make films about, but had been thinking for a long time about making a film about prisons, and was also thinking there's sort of two things that kind of converged into the idea for this film and the form that it takes. One was just a sort of observation and a kind of musing on this thing that, on the one hand feels like a contradiction, which is that in, the U.S. prison system has at this point, become as large as it has. It's the largest experiment in incarceration on the planet and in human history. And at the same time as that's happened, there's a way in which, at a whole bunch of different levels, prisons are just more invisible than they've ever been. Prisons used to be easier to access for people who were doing research or who were doing organizing or who were doing moving image work. They used to be sort of more available just as, in kind of social space, like they used to be built in cities, and now they're built in really rural areas, and they're hard to find on maps. There's a way in which there's a kind of organization of the prison's invisibility at the same time as it's this massive institution that so dominates the American landscape. So I was thinking about this, like, on the one hand, just as a kind of, so-called problem for a filmmaker. Like, how do you make a film about prisons if they're hard to get inside, if they're hard to get access to? But also in a kind of like, okay, what's the relationship between how people, the sort of, consensus or complacency around the prison system when we don't see them as much? Is there a relationship between how we're thinking about them and their role in society and the degree to which we see them or not, and the terms in which we see them? So just thinking about all of these things and really kind of thinking about this supposed access problem as a kind of opportunity to just do the work of seeing the prison differently, and kind of playing with the idea or exploring the idea of suggesting, as I think the film does, that one actually doesn't need to look at the building itself, like one doesn't need to get inside the building itself to produce a visual reflection on the role of the prison in our lives, but also actually there could be some advantages to looking everywhere but the actual building in terms of seeing the prison differently and thinking about it differently, and thinking about it, again, not just as a building, but maybe as a structure of power, maybe as an institution that has to do with these things, and intersects with our lives, those of us who think we don't have a relationship to the prison system in ways that we didn't maybe expect it to. Yeah. It was a long answer, sorry.
No. It's perfect. It's fantastic. And so then you start making the film, and obviously these things start happening then just like in the news and in life. And so I'm going to make an assumption that you did not expect for these things to happen while you were making the film, but then you decide to add them in.
Yeah, I think that for a long time I didn't expect, and I didn't plan to have, for example, a protest scene in the film. I was really, again, I'm interested in playing and thinking about, the violence of the prison system, not through the lens of the spectacular violence that we're used to seeing it, not wanting to make a film in which we go inside and show like an incredible scene of violence inflicted on a particular body, but to think actually about the kind of slow violence, like how people's time is stolen, the banality, the tedium of being harassed all the time, of having to try and find out where the courthouse is, you know, when you have to pay your $300 fine, or, you know, like the tedium of putting together a package that then gets returned to you. So all of these ways in which there's a kind of slow violence that's endemic to the prison system. And so I didn't think, you know, like protest scene was sort of like outside of, again, I kind of wanted to work outside of the usual tropes, but of course the Black Lives Movement, Matter movement was taking off at the same time as I was working on this, and it's not only incredibly inspiring to me, but also in a way answered one of the prompts that I was asking with the film, which is just, you know, what are some spaces that prisons produce? What do prisons do other than supposedly resolve the problem of crime? And of course, one of the things prisons do is produce resistance. I mean, people resist inside all the time. We just don't get to see about it or hear about it. And people protest on the outside against Black Death and against police violence and against harassment and against disinvestment. And it felt, you know, at a certain point I was like, this is an incredible part of the effect that prisons have, and it feels like a disservice to this incredible organizing work not to have at least a moment in which that gets figured into the film.
It's fantastic. It's extremely powerful. I mean, especially the moment when, outside of the protest, but when you're in the car with the man in St. Louis, outside of Ferguson, and he talks about just like the way he's been oppressed and the way he feels and how that's made his worldview, and it's just like it encapsulates it so very distinctly in a very short period of time, and so it's extremely powerful.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, and I think, you know, thinking a lot, I get the question often, like, what it means to be a Canadian filmmaker, and I don't even have a very good answer to that, but I do think a lot about what it means to be a white filmmaker who's making a film about the U.S. prison system, and I think for me, it relates a lot to, you know, including whiteness in the conversation about how prisons organize race and how prisons are an institution that has racial consequences, and what is the investment of whiteness in the prison system? Like, is it through property values in Detroit and how those property values are securitized through police, or what are the other ways in which whiteness figures? And, you know, like that instance with Derek in the car, that's a good example of how, you know, for the people that, many of the people you see in the film isn't made for them. It doesn't say anything that they don't already know. It's really made for people in some ways who don't necessarily think that their lives intersect with the prison system in some way, and think of their lives as outside of that system or that institution. And yeah, I think that just was a sort of important part of like how the film came together and takes the form that it does.
Oh, it's amazing. I want to make sure that we have time to open it up for people too. Are there questions? Olivia.
Hey, hi. Thanks for sharing your film. Going off of what you just said, I just, when I was watching the Quicken Loans scene, I just like thought I stopped breathing. I couldn't take it. I was like, I'd like to hear more about, going off of what you just said about responsibility and accountability and talking about that scene. It was like really hard for me to watch.
Well, that tour was 3 hours long, so if it was hard for you to watch for 7 minutes, imagine like just being with that guy for 3 hours and being like, this is very interesting, tell me more. Show me more interns. Okay, I'll eat more novelty popcorn, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that scene, there's a sort of story. I think, you know, most filmmakers can tell a story about their work that's like, on the one hand, you know, this was my vision for what this scene is about and how it came up and what it looks like. And then there's a sort of like story of, this is what I wanted to get and why I couldn't get it and what it became instead. And so I knew I wanted to have a scene that touched on urban gentrification and revitalization projects and the way in which cities are transformed by real estate, and the way in which, however, seemingly tangentially, that involves a security apparatus. Like that's not a neutral process. That involves evictions and displacements and police and crimes against homelessness and inevitably incarceration, right? So I knew that was a kind of thematic I wanted to hit. And originally, my decision to go to Detroit came about because I knew that Dan Gilbert, this billionaire who made all of his money off of online, mortgages, housing mortgages, is pouring all of this money into the revitalization of Detroit. But I read specifically about one particular room in his Quicken Loans headquarters, which is like a command center that's just wall-to-wall security cameras, security monitors connected to security cameras affixed to all of the buildings, all those buildings that light up on that nice model they have. And so my original idea was just, I'll just locked off shot in this room full of monitors connected to all of the security cameras that will tell us, something about this incredible security apparatus. And then I contacted them and made my request, and they were like, no way. But come on, and we'll give you this tour that we give every day. And Madonna was just here last week, and she really loves this horse lamp that we have, and you'll love it. And I just was like, this is going to be terrible, but maybe my I can distract the guy, and my camera woman can go into the command center, and we'll get in anyways. But actually, we started doing that tour, and it did feel like, again, there's it feels like a scene for me that has a lot of different layers to it and is maybe more oblique than other scenes, but the degree to which this weird, almost absurd investment in creative, creative capitalism and the wanting to be the Silicon Valley of the Midwest, and the ways in which cities are transformed internally, culturally, but then also obviously include, the sex parlor down the road burning down, and oops, we don't know why that happened, but we like it, and here's a private security guard that we've hired to, keep the streets clean. That was sort of part and parcel of this whole ridiculous 3-hour tour that he took us on, and it felt like there was enough there to, for us to enter into the intensity of that project.
Yeah. It was so striking. I'm from Detroit, and I just went back recently, and when I left Detroit 4 years ago, everything in that area downtown, that you were filming, was boarded up windows. The buildings were boarded up. There were no windows. The city was vacant, and it was huge. And I just went back this May, and it's all, the Quicken Loans people have they own everything, and there's all these chain stores now through there. There's a Whole Foods in the middle of Detroit.
Yeah, shocking. You'd never guess from his tour that it's a city that's 80% black, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's striking. And that, yeah.
You just mentioned that your original request to the Quicken Loans guy was denied. I'm curious how you generally approached people or explained what your project was, the people that you ended up filming.
Yeah, so I generally, 99% of the time, have a practice of being very transparent about what I'm doing and what I'm up to. So even, it's just sort of I feel like that's part of the relationship I'm trying to forge. I'm I'm here, I'm making this project about prisons and their effect on communities, and this is how I feel about them, but I am curious about how that's affected you or what's going on. So that's generally how I work. Even in places like Appalachia, where I was very cognizant of going into an area that's already overdetermined by images. There are a lot of outsiders that go into that part of the country with cameras and image making machines, and not all of those images do a service to the people who actually live there. So I was very conscious of that, and also knew people, generally want, like the prisons and want the prisons to be coming to their town. So I was even a little nervous about how they'd respond, but still sort of generally have a practice of, and I feel like this has born true is, if I'm pretty honest about what I'm doing and why, but I'm also honest about not having preconceived ideas about what people, who people are or how they fit into that or what their response is going to be. If I'm able to also translate my genuine interest in where people are coming from and what they have to say about it, then people respond. Like, people can tell when they, I think when they're being lied to and when they're not, and when someone is genuinely respects them and is interested in their opinion. And even in actually Appalachia, the response I got for the most part was like, well, are you here to make an anti-coal film? Like, that's the sort of line in which, is uncrossable. We've had enough of that. But I was like, no, I'm here to make a film about why so many prisons are being built here. But the question I have for you is what you think will make your lives better and why. And people responded to that. So the only exception is in cases maybe like Quicken Loans, where I feel like I'm up against a machinery or an institution of immense power. And even in those cases, I don't outright lie. But, in this case, I feel like I think what I said to them was like, I'm interested in the revitalization project and the kinds of security measures you have been enacting in order to make that revitalization possible, which is true. But I didn't say, I hate the police and I hate prisons, or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting and important how you demonstrated these economic and political connections between communities that are normally seen as really disconnected, namely white rural communities, black urban communities, especially right now we're in a political moment where these are seen as these disparate worlds when in fact they're like so economically linked. But I was really curious how you decided to have those sort of like borders of your film be the United States of America, since increasingly obviously like the American prison is an export, whether that's to Canada or to Israel for the containment of Palestinian prisoners. But this is actually like that interconnectivity is not just something within the United States, but it's also global. And you are coming from a different nation state with different borders and a different history of the prison system. So I was curious how you decided to focus in on the United States of America and what that limitation meant to you.
Yeah, I think sometimes I feel like I just need to understand from the beginning of a project what its limitations are going to be, because otherwise I'm already too interested in everything and how the thing I'm looking at is connected to many other things and how those things are connected to other things. So I know that can get out of hand. And so even the form of the film for me was an architecture that was necessary to contain some of the complexity that I wanted to be able to indulge. And so it felt necessary, again, because I had these series of prompts for myself, and there were too many answers to them. So even confining myself to the United States and asking the question, okay, how do prisons produce outside spaces? How can we see the prison in supposedly free places? And what are the work that prisons do outside of the problem of crime? Like asking myself these questions and looking for places and landscapes that answered those questions in some way. There are too many of them, like this could have been 50 landscapes or 60 landscapes. So I think the reason to focus on the United States, beyond I'd been doing other kinds of work on the U.S. prison system for a long time, and I knew it very well, and I had done a lot of research already, was really just, and when I show the film in Canada, I often say, like, I do think this film could have been made in the Canadian context and maybe will be, or in some respect. But I do think that there's something particular to the scale, again, kind of what I said earlier about just like really kind of taking seriously as something actually quite bizarre, like, that I like that there are more people in prisons and cages in the United States than anywhere in the world and at any other time in human history. It's actually like really wild. And so to sort of take that sort of basic fact as itself a kind of prompt to think about, like, how does that come to be? How does that become normal? What's some scenery that can kind of like upset our sense of the normalcy of that phenomena? Yeah, but I totally agree that it's not meant to sort of exceptionalize the United States or suggest that, you know, those practices are not completely shared and traveling, you know, throughout the world.
It's also expensive to fly around the world.
Yes, it is very expensive. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your film. At the center of the film is I believe it's the sixth or seventh the sequence is Detroit, 1967, which stands out in a number of ways. Obviously, like sort of materially, in terms of the source of the material, as well as historically, and it certainly kind of grounds us in the longer history of. You know, if not, you know, as long of the scale as we certainly need to attempt to address the problem, but a longer history in terms of the, you know, shifts in police tactics and in the way we have of understanding the problem that you're addressing. So I'm just curious how you decided to make that shift and what role you see that section playing, both in terms of how it formally changes the approach that you're taking, as well as the kind of historical information that you think that sequence is giving to your viewers.
Yeah, so I probably didn't think enough about how formally, how much formally it shakes things up. I think that I was thinking, I mean, at a sort of early moment in the film's conception, I was thinking a lot of just about the relationship between cities and prisons. And, you know, there's a long history of there being like a very direct relationship between what's going on in cities and what's going on, you know, at how mass incarceration has come to be. And so, and I think in actually the first iteration of the film, it was all going to take place in just one outside space, and it was going to be an urban neighborhood. But I did think, you know, this isn't a film that tells a like historical story, explains mass incarceration from one particular moment up till today. But at the same time, it felt important to at least have a moment or a few moments where we could be historical and we could sort of think about, you know, this sort of, especially thinking about this in terms of like, a lot of conversation about the militarization of the police, as if it's like a new phenomena, you know, as if like police only got like hardcore like, you know, battle gear against protesters or against poor people in cities like in this moment. And you know, that has a long history, and you know, and in fact, like we can trace in a bunch of ways, you can trace the sort of really intense rise of incarceration rates to this moment in time in the late 60s and then early 70s, in which cities all over the country were witnessing huge amounts of social unrest, mostly led by people of color who were fighting against disinvestment in their public institutions and mass unemployment and racism. And you know, the way in which the institution of the police and the institution of the sort of law and order regime was deployed against protesters through the kind of veil of criminalizing them has, you know, played an important role in that history, but also obviously speaks to this moment. You know, it's like, you can't, you know, I watch what's going on in Standing Rock and I think about Detroit in '67, or I think about Los Angeles in the same period and in the 90s and, you know, during other moments. So I know it does sort of feel strange to just have this one kind of plunge into a longer history, but it felt like I wanted the scenes to speak to each other in different ways with different threads, and it felt like an important way to have a scene that spoke to the Baltimore scene, but also spoke to the Quicken Loans scene and to St. Louis also, and to have some of those ties.
Yeah, sort of relatedly, I'd be curious to hear you talk about concluding with Attica.
Concluding with Attica, yeah. Yeah, there was a way, I mean, so the conceit of the film is that it's a film about the prison, which you never see a prison. And I was thinking about a few things. I was thinking about, sort of, when you make a film, you try and anticipate all the ways it can go wrong. And one of the ways that it felt like it could go wrong was if people came away thinking that the prison was being treated as a metaphor, as if it was like, oh, the prison is just like everywhere and everything. And I really wanted the film to work against that idea. And so it felt like, on the one hand, just important to have this moment, kind of when we least expect it, where we have to contend with the fact that, oh, on top of everything, it's also a building over there where people are living their lives. And so that was one thing. The other thing was that I knew from the very beginning that I was going to start on this bus, and that I was going to try and construct the sort of feeling of the bus as a kind of like really familiar experience. Like we've all been on a night bus. We've all been on a highway that looks like it could be everywhere, tired, thinking about things. There's a kind of way I wanted to play with the sense that that's a universal experience, and then upset that when we find out the sort of the specificity of that. And it felt like a way to bring us back, to be like, this journey these people are on has a conclusion. It has an end space, and it's this prison. To just tie into that. And then third, it's like an homage in a bunch of different ways, but it's specifically an homage to prison resistance. I mean, it's like, it is where that bus is going in upstate New York, but it's also, of the many prisons in upstate New York, it's the one with the most familiar history of prison resistance, 45 years ago. And it felt useful to sort of remind us, to have to confront us with that edifice, but also be like, that building was a place in which people didn't just live, but they fought back. So yeah, there were a few things going on with that decision.
I have a question, and thank you for all this as well. I really enjoyed it. But in terms of the formal aspects of filming and your relationship to the way or the architecture that you spoke about in the previous comment, how do you sort of reason or think about the politics of your film in terms of the aesthetics of it? And it was very deliberate in how it kind of constructed story and vignettes, and I'm just curious as to your thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, it was very generous of Becca to say at the beginning that, that I work in the space between documentary and avant-garde work or experimental work, and I feel like I draw a lot from cinematic traditions in which breaking certain rules is part of the politics. There's a politics to the aesthetic decision to do things that are supposedly wrong, that aren't neat and narratively conventional. And those are the works that I really enjoy. Those are the works where I can't predict what's going to happen or how I'm going to feel. They're the ones that leave a sense of strangeness and there's something exciting about just being so unsettled, and I think experimental aesthetics and structures can have that effect. And for me in particular, when I think about making political cinema, I guess I feel interested in working outside of familiar tropes and organizational structures that are predictable enough that we can just sort of be sort of complacent consumers of that work. And I like structures that challenge our sort of narrative expectations, and I think that can offer a space for people to not even have to, but are invited to meet the film, in a kind of third space or meet it halfway. And so, yeah, the structure takes its fragmented form for a bunch of reasons, but they include just a general interest in formal strategies that, as I said before, give a kind of organizational structure and architecture to complex ideas, but that also take us out of comfort zones as far as what we expect cinema to be, especially cinema where we think we've seen it before. We think maybe we've seen prison documentaries they do tend to take the same form over and over again, and I think that they don't do the kind of political work that we maybe expect them to do, even when they're telling like very moving stories.
To follow up on that, I was curious about to bring up intention and intended audience. Do you see this film as a tool for mobilization? Do you see it fitting into a canon of the art world or academia? And then I'm curious about diversity of audience and locations where you screened it.
Yeah, I mean, I find it really hard to answer questions about audience, because there's a part, I mean, I don't know how other filmmakers work, but I make films and I have to be like, nobody's gonna see this, it will die before it ever has a life, and I just have to be okay with that, which, one is not, one makes it work so that it is seen and has a life, but also a life maybe that is useful and complements, I feel like I do some organizing. I know a lot of people that do on the ground organizing, and I just don't think that the role of a piece of art is to replicate what that work is, and in fact couldn't possibly. I have too much respect for what on the ground organizing is, and rather I think that when things are really hard, when we're at political moments in which there's a lot that needs to be done, we just have to find, we have to work on all levels. And for me, making this film was, without even having a very developed sense of who the audience is, it was really just an attempt to offer something that would give people an object against which to maybe think differently about this thing that people don't even think about anymore, because it's assumed to be natural, as if the prison has always been here, as if we have to have it, as if it has to be at the scale that it is. And the hope was just to offer something that could chip away at the kind of common sense that makes that possible, or the framework within, I think that's the other thing about a lot of prison films that I see, is that they don't do anything to chip away at the framework in which prisons are just a response to crime, and maybe they're not a very good response, but that's what they're doing. They're trying to deal with criminals. And so I wanted to make a film about prisons that's not about crime at all. That's about jobs, and it's about housing, and it's about real estate, and it's about how one tries to imagine futurity for themselves. These are big questions, and I wanted to offer them as having bearing on this institution that's supposed to be about something else. So, if organizers find it useful, that's amazing to me. And if educators find it useful, and I know people are using it in classrooms, and that's really exciting. And if I can show it at festivals to general audiences and have people be like, oh, I didn't know that, they're just, ways to create jobs, or anything, right? That's exciting to me. And so, I did screen the film in a prison in Ontario to about 100 men inside, and that was really wonderful. And but again, I don't think the film taught them anything that they don't know already. And I think, if anything, the only thing really it offered to them was, I hope anyways, was a demonstration that they're not alone and they're not forgotten, that there are people on the outside that are doing work to try and transform ways of thinking and feeling about this particular institution.
Yeah, Margaret.
Speaking of, thank you for your film. That was really beautiful and meaningful. Speaking of ways that organizers can use your film as a complement, just wanted to highlight that some of the prison organizers here, we've handed out a call that if folks can make a call to one of the local prisons, and there's an informational sheet. You guys might have gotten the green sheet. CIW, a local prison, has 8 times the highest suicide rate in the country, and it's something that we're working to address. And there's an informational sheet. If you didn't get one, feel free to. We might have some on the way out. And a call if folks want to make a simple call to help highlight and bring some awareness to trying to fix that system. That would be huge. And yeah, hopefully. So that's one other opportunity you've helped organize. So.
No, thank you. Thanks so much for that.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much for sticking around.